Thank you for inviting me into your classroom. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Kevin Hemp. I'm the water guy. I work for this company here, CV Water District. And do we all know what CV stands for? Yes, Coachella Valley Water District. So CV is Coachella Valley, and I work for the Coachella Valley Water District. So we're not the only water district in the Coachella Valley, but we are the oldest. We've been here over 100 years, and we are the largest. So since I do work for a water district, guess what we're going to talk about today? Yes, water. Now for fourth grade, our discussion about water revolves around local, or rather California history, and we tie it into local history. And so because of that, we've entitled this presentation, Shaping the Desert, or A Tale of Two Valleys. As you know, a tale is a story. So Shaping the Desert, or A Story of Two Valleys. The shaping of the desert refers to how water over time has shaped the Coachella Valley into what it is today. Being a desert area, water is very, very important here. And we could not live the way we do without water. And so we're going to take a look at how water has affected the growth of this area. Now, A Tale of Two Valleys. This story actually involves not only the Coachella Valley that we live in, but another valley as well, the Imperial Valley, which is south of us. And so, in a sense, these two valleys kind of grew up together, if you will. And it was because of water that we were able to grow and become what we are today. So to understand this, let's look at a satellite picture of this area that shows the two valleys here. So let's jump into it. Okay, so here's the picture. Now, before we get into the details of it, I'd like to point out at the top right of the screen, you see something we call a rose compass. And typically, when you have a rose compass on a map or a satellite picture like this, usually north is at the top. But in this case, the picture is turned sideways. So north, in fact, in this picture is not at the top. So just keep that in mind. So whereas north on this picture, north, in fact, is right there. So north is pointing to the right. West is at the top. Okay, so the two valleys. Let's look at the Coachella Valley. So I outlined the Coachella Valley in light blue there. That's where we live. And let's see, west of the Coachella Valley is the Pacific Ocean. So that big blue spot out there, yes, that is the ocean. Okay, now if you go east, which would be down from the Pacific Ocean, you run into the second valley that we're going to talk about today, and that is the Imperial Valley. Let's see, what else do we have on our satellite image? Yes, we have this line. It's a border that actually separates two countries in this picture here. Anybody want to guess what two countries are involved in this satellite image? Yes, correct. Mexico to the left and the United States to the right. Okay, what else can we talk about here? Well, okay, and right kind of at almost in the middle of the screen, there's this big blue area here. Does that look familiar to anybody? Anybody know what that is? I put a question mark there. That, in fact, is the largest lake in California. It's right in our backyard, in a way. That is the Salton Sea. Yep, that is the Salton Sea right there. Okay. Also on our satellite image, I put 3 more question marks. And I put these question marks in areas that appear, if you look closely, if you look at them, they appear to be somewhat, I don't know how to describe them. They look kind of greenish, brownish, splotchy areas. The geography there is different. It's kind of distinct than the rest of the surrounding land. And my question is, what are those areas and why does it look that way? Well, I'll just tell you, it's because of water. These are populated areas in this desert region of Southern California and Mexico. And these are areas where people are applying water to the ground. And so you can see that when you apply water to the ground, the applying of water to the ground, we call that irrigation. Irrigation. So when the desert is irrigated, it actually shapes the desert. It changes it. So with that thought in mind, I kind of diagrammed it out here a little bit. You can see at the top we have non-irrigated areas versus irrigated areas at the bottom. So the irrigated areas, if you look in the little circles there to the one in Mexico and the one in the United States, the land is of a uniform texture and color. Okay, you could very easily see that is a sandy area, and it's uniformly sandy. Okay. However, when you get into the areas where I had the question marks, you can see the splotchy areas. Those are the irrigated areas. Those are the areas where water is being applied. And if you looked at those areas from the ground, you would actually see the way that people are living in those areas. And so one of the ways that people are using water in this area is through home use. So we have a lot of homeowners in these areas. And the homeowners, inevitably, they like to irrigate their property. They like to plant grass there. They like to plant flowers. They like to plant trees. And they have to water these things to make them grow. So that, again, in a way, you could say it turns the desert green. Yes. So we're looking at homes. We're also looking at farms. A lot of farmland in these areas. We have probably between the Coachella Valley and the Imperial Valley and Mexico, we probably have about 3 million acres of farmland. Maybe not quite that much, maybe about 2.5. And to give you an idea how big an acre is roughly the size of a football field. So imagine like 2 or 3 million football fields of farmland. Well, we have a lot of farms in the desert. And the farmers, in order to grow food for us to eat, what do they need? They need water. Yeah, so they apply water to their land, and what do you know? It turns green. In the Coachella Valley, not so much in Imperial Valley in Mexico, but we also have a lot of these. Golf courses. Yes. Recreation actually is an important part of life, okay? So one way that people recreate in the Coachella Valley is through golf. And so to support the vacation golf lifestyle, we have golf courses. And again, to keep the grass green in the golf courses, you need water. So those are the areas that we're looking at. We're looking at irrigated areas in those areas. Now, for this presentation, this presentation actually goes back 171 years. So we're going to start in the year 1849, which is an important year in California history. And if you don't know already, we'll talk about it. But we're going to start in 1849, and we're going to come all the way up to the present day and talk about how water has shaped the desert from then until now. So starting in 1849, if you were to look at this same picture back then, it would look completely different. So keep an eye on the screen, because we're going to go back to 1849. This is what this area looked like back then. Yeah, there was really nothing there. No Salton Sea, no golf courses, no homes, no farms, none of that. It was just basically sand and desert. That was pretty much it. So we're going to talk about how it got from that to what it is today. If that was a little confusing for you, I can kind of demonstrate what this might look like on the ground. So let's look at an example of this from the ground. So here's a picture of the Coachella Valley as it looks today. Okay, you can see the homes, you can see some of the greenery there. I see some golf courses in there. This is as it appears today, but back in 1849, it would have looked like this. Yeah, completely different. And what caused the change? Yeah, is water. Irrigation has caused the change. So here's another example. So we could say that this is what the Coachella Valley may have looked like in 1849, but today, with the application of water to the desert, it now looks like this. Instant golf course. And so you kind of get the idea. This change, the watering of the desert, the bringing in the importation of water into the deserts of Southern California, began with this gentleman here. His name was Dr. O.M. Wozencraft. Very interesting figure. He was a doctor. He was a medical doctor. And our staff actually, I learned about him and our staff learned about him by reading this book here. If you get a chance to read it, it's a good read. It's called Hoover Dam, An American Adventure by Joseph E. Stevens. It's written kind of like an adventure novel. It's very engaging, very entertaining. It's a fun read, actually. But with that said, I've read other books about Dr. Wozencraft as well, and I will say up front, I've come across some conflicting stories about his life. So there's one version, this version here actually says he almost died in the desert. Another version says he didn't. But I'm going to go with this story here because it's the most adventurous. So the story of Dr. Wozencraft from this book. So the year that Dr. Wozencraft got his idea to bring water into the deserts of Southern California was a famous year in California history, 1849. Now, why is that a famous year? Well, that is the year of the California Gold Rush. And so in 1848, gold was discovered in California. I believe Sutter's Mill, American River. The people that discovered the gold in 1848, they tried to keep it a secret. Weren't very good at it. Word got out. And by 1849, people were rushing to California by the tens of thousands to try to get rich from finding gold. So the people that rushed to California to get the gold were called 49ers because of the year 1849. In fact, I have a picture of a 49er rushing, if you want to see it. There you go. Okay. I'm imagining everybody's laughing right now. That's a joke. Okay. Yes, 49ers. He is rushing. But these are not the 49ers we're talking about. 49ers we're talking about are these kind of 49ers. These are the gold seekers. These are the people coming to California in 1849 to try to get rich from finding gold. Now, with that said, most of the 49ers actually did not find any gold, or very little. Some did get rich. Some found a lot, but most did not. So this 49er here, he actually found some gold, and he's showing it off in this photograph. And he's saying, I'm almost happy enough to smile. It's like, you notice old photographs, they didn't smile that much back then. I think it's because of the photography equipment. I don't think it was because of the people, but that's another story. But anyway, you can see he has some gold in his pan. And I've talked to some people, we've done a little estimating here. And we estimate that by today's standards, that's probably about $20,000 worth of gold by today's standards. Now, I know what that means is back then, the average worker making about $120 a year, that made him a very rich man. And so, anyway, this is what people were going crazy over, was the gold. And one of the people that went crazy over the gold was, yes, Dr. Wozencraft. Dr. Wozencraft practiced medicine in Louisiana, specifically in the city of New Orleans. And one morning, he woke up, was eating breakfast, and he opened up the paper. Now, for those of you out there that don't know what a newspaper is, back in the old days, before they had the internet, people used to get the paper delivered to their house that had the daily news in it. And so he picked up the paper and he opened it up, and guess what he read? Gold discovered in California. And Dr. Wozencraft got what we call gold fever. Now, gold fever is not like a physical sickness. It's more like a mental or psychological obsession. He became obsessed with the idea of getting rich from finding gold in California. So what he did was he sold his medical practice, sold his belongings, bought himself a really fast horse, bought as many supplies as he could carry with him, and he jumped on his horse and he started to ride for California. Now think about it, 1849, he's riding from Louisiana, from New Orleans to California. Were there any good roads to California back then? No, there were not. At best, there were some well-defined trails, if that. So it was not an easy journey. It was actually very dangerous. People that traveled to California across the United States back then were risking their lives. They really were. In fact, many died trying to get to the gold fields in California. Now, we're not really sure what route Dr. Wozencraft would have taken, because he never, according to the book, he never made it to his destination. And he actually got defeated by the desert here in Southern California. So again, back to our satellite picture, let's trace out some of the trails back then that existed that 49ers could travel along. One of the main ones that traveled through Southern California here, through the desert, was this one. It was called the Southern Emigrant Trail. And the Southern Emigrant Trail actually was actually part of an older trail that was blazed in 1774 by a Spanish explorer by the name of De Anza. The 1774 De Anza Trail, Juan Bautista de Anza, actually followed this route, but instead you see it splits, and the Emigrant Trail actually goes left and it'll take you to San Diego, but the original De Anza Trail goes to the right and will take you to Los Angeles. So we're not really sure which route he was, or which way he was going to go, but either way it would have gotten him to one of these areas. Now, once he would have gotten to either San Diego or Los Angeles, he would have connected to another old Spanish trail that they started construction on it in 1769. It's the El Camino Real, the Royal Highway or the King's Highway. And that was the trail that would take the 49ers along the California coast all the way north up into Sacramento to where the gold was. And so that was probably his plan. So we said that he was defeated by the desert. He was overcome by it. Well, what was in the desert that he could not overcome that actually stopped his journey? Let's take a look. Here were some obstacles along the way that had to be traversed, had to be crossed. One, there was the largest stretch of sand dunes in California. Well, he was going to have to figure out how to get around those. Then there was hundreds of miles of barren wasteland. You know, today we don't really call it barren wasteland, but they did back then. The barren wasteland, it was a very scary place. It was a place where there absolutely was no water at all. The only way to get across it was you had to carry whatever water you had to get you through that portion of the trail. And if you ran out of water, then you died. That was pretty much it. The Spanish had suffered through this portion of the desert back in 1774, and they actually gave it a name. The Spanish actually named this section of the trail the Camino del Diablo, or the Devil's Highway. And so not a fun place to travel through. Now, if you're able to get through that, you're going to have to traverse through a depression in the desert. This is a place where the desert actually sunk down into the ground and was encrusted with salt. Back then, it was called the Salton Sink. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? I know. Today, we don't call it the Salton Sink because it's full of water, and we call it the Salton Sea. But back then, it was dried up and it was full of salt. So he's going to have to cross that. Then he was going to have to cross mountains and more mountains. Wow, what a trail. So let's look at some of these obstacles. Let's look at the Salton Sink. Salton Sink, looking at the little notes here. It says 280 feet below sea level. So it's actually below the level of the ocean by 280 feet. That makes it the second lowest spot in North America. So I think the first lowest is Death Valley, which is about 300 feet below sea level. I don't have any pictures of the Salton Sink from 1849. The oldest one I have is from 1884. And let's take a look at it. Here it is. This picture of the Salton Sink actually is labeled New Liverpool Salt Works, 1884. And the reason it's labeled that is because in 1882, there was a gentleman, I forgot his name, but he saw that this area of desert was encrusted with salt, and it was very pure quality. And so he actually called it white gold. And basically, he said, I could sell this. So he claimed that property, and he started harvesting salt. He made a salt company there, and he called it the New Liverpool Salt Works. Basically, he would put people to work by running these carts, these scrapers across the desert, and it would scrape up the salt. And a team of 2 people like this could scrape up 700 tons of salt a day. And he had many, many crews out there scraping up the salt. So anyway, that's the Salton Sink. If we look at the sand dunes, this is a 60-mile stretch of sand dunes. Today we call it it's actually called the Algodones sand dunes. Half of the sand dunes are in the United States, the other half are down in Mexico. Collectively, we tend to call the whole area Glamis. Now, maybe you've never heard of Glamis, but if you live in the Coachella Valley and you own like quads or motorcycles or sand rails, you've definitely heard of Glamis, because that's where all the people with sand toys go to play in the sand out there, Glamis. And this picture shows that stretch of sand dunes there. You remember I was trying to point out the greenish, brownish, splotchy areas. This picture shows a portion of the greenish, brownish, splotchy area here in the lower right portion of the screen. Can you see it down there? That's farmland in Mexico. Those are irrigated fields, farm fields in Mexico. So that kind of shows it a little more up close. Okay. Now, if you were to look at these sand dunes, if you were to stand right in them, this is what it would look like. Pretty intimidating. You try to put yourself back in 1849 trying to cross these sand dunes. I don't know if you've ever tried to walk in soft sand. It's kind of like 1 step forward, 2 steps back. It takes a lot of work, a lot of effort, and especially if it's really hot and you're carrying your water, not going to be good. Just for fun, kind of a side note, this portion of Southern California is very popular with Hollywood. And by Hollywood, I mean movie makers, people that make movies. There have been more than 200 desert scenes filmed in this area probably in the last 50 years. And probably one of the more famous desert scenes from a famous Hollywood movie filmed here was from Star Wars. Yes. And what do you know? Just for fun, I was on a tour out in this area a few years ago, and we stopped off for a break at the sand dunes to let people kind of look around, and we drove up on a film crew. Just kind of stumbled on them. They were taking a break, and they were filming one of the latest installments from Star Wars. And so we actually got to hang out with the crew, and not really hang out with them, but they were nice enough to let us get pictures with them and stuff. So that was pretty cool. But Glamis, Algodones sand dunes, very sandy, very intimidating place to cross if you're trying to do it on foot or horseback. Actually, it'd be much easier if you're crossing it on a motorcycle, because then it's very fast. But Dr. Wozencraft, no motorcycles back then, only horses. So let's trace Dr. Wozencraft's trail from New Orleans to the Colorado River. And Colorado River, if you look on our map here, there's a blue line. That is the Colorado River. We'll talk about that in a second. At the bottom of the screen here, you see a date. It says it has a month and a year, May 1849. Dr. Wozencraft followed this trail through several territories and states and finally ended up in a little territory, which later was to become Arizona, a place called Yuma, Arizona, in May of 1849. And when he got there, he was kind of surprised at what he found. What he found was thousands of people, 49ers, just like himself, camping on the banks of the Colorado River. But before I talk about that, if you're having trouble visualizing the river here, let's zoom in on it a little bit. This might help you see it a little more clearly. Okay, so here is a zoomed in portion of the river. You can see on this blue strip here, that is the Colorado River. And on the left and on the right are two separate states. The left of the river is the state of California. The right of the river is the state of Arizona. But anyway, Dr. Wozencraft found thousands of 49ers camping out on the banks of the river, and it looked like they were not in a hurry to go anywhere anytime quickly. And he was kind of puzzled by this, and so he started talking to people, and he said, are you going to California to get gold in Sacramento? And they said, yeah. And he said, well, how come you're camped out here? He said, let's go across the river, let's go get the gold. And they said, no way. They said, it is the month of May. It is approaching summertime. It is getting very hot. And they said, it would be suicide to try and cross that desert in the middle of the summer. They said, we're going to camp out here where we know there's water at least until December, maybe even as late as January. And then we'll try to cross the desert when we have a better chance at finding water in cooler weather. Well, Dr. Wozencraft started counting up the months. He realized that was like 8 or 9 months away. And he was kind of impatient. He'd already traveled a long ways, and he didn't want to wait anymore. So he said, you know what? He says, I'm not waiting. I'm going. And so for better or for worse, he took his horse and he crossed that river and tried to head across the desert of Southern California there. And of course, it was a disastrous decision. As the book tells us, he nearly died. Lost his horse, ran out of water, was near death. Fortunately, when people found out he was a doctor, he was a medical doctor, the people of Yuma there, they had kind of built a little community there. And there were actually people, they were trying to construct in a town, and they wanted a doctor. And so knowing it was a bad idea for him to wander out into the desert by himself in the summertime, they sent a search party after him. And it was a good thing too, because they saved his life. When they found him, he was recorded to have been digging in a dry riverbed trying to find water, and he was delirious. And so they rescued him, they gave him water, they brought him back to Yuma and nursed him back to health. And when he came to his senses, he said something pretty interesting. He said, you know, the real gold in California is not gold. He said, the real gold is water. He said, I would have given everything I owned for just a little bit of water when I was dying of thirst out there in the desert. And that changed the course of his entire life. From that moment on, Dr. Wozencraft gave up his search for gold, but it started him on a new search. He became obsessed with trying to figure out a way how to get water into the deserts of Southern California. And so he had a plan. But before we get to the plan, let's take another visit to the Colorado River. Here's the Colorado River as it looks today. Now, if Dr. Wozencraft had come up on this scene back then, it would have looked a little different. And let me explain. The water in the Colorado River today looks like what I call a normal river. It's actually the water, excuse me, you could actually say it's blue, right? It looks like normal. And by normal, the Colorado River is not a normal river. Most rivers are nice and kind of bluish and clear like this. But the Colorado River, in fact, its very name, it was named by the Spanish in 1776. The Spanish named it Rio for river, Colorado for color red, or the red-colored river, or just the Red River. And the reason they named it that was because back then, the water was not blue. It was red. And I have a picture, we'll show you what it looks like. You may say, well, it looks more brownish. But it was like this reddish brownish color because it was so full of mud that they called it the Red River, Rio, Colorado, the Colorado River. So if you look at it today, it's not like that. And people say, well, what happened to the mud? We'll talk about that. Just hang in there. But just know this. So here, the river divides two states. If you look on the left side of the screen, you're in Arizona. You cross over, get on the land on the other side, you're in California. So if you think about it, the boat there in the middle of the picture is probably in both states at the same time. Pretty cool. Okay, moving on. Dr. Wozencraft had a plan to get water into the deserts of Southern California and involved the Colorado River. What he planned to do was dig himself or build a canal. And I represented the canal in our picture by this blue line here. It says canal on it. And what he planned to do was dig this ditch and connect it to the Colorado River and take water from the river, put it in his ditch, and the water would flow through the ditch. It would flow into the desert, and then he would take that river water and he would irrigate. He would irrigate the desert and change it from a barren wasteland to farmland. And then he would sell the land and make millions of dollars. That was his plan. So, if you don't know what a canal is, they're very common today in Southern California. In fact, here's a picture of the canal that runs through the Coachella Valley. There it is right there. You can see all of that lush green farmland below the canal. The farms are getting their water from the canal, which is filled with water from the Colorado River. Again, very common today. Now, if you've ever heard a presentation from the Water District, you know that anytime we talk about the canal, we always take a minute or two and talk about the dangers of the canal. So if you ever see one, you know to stay away from it. So let me just step aside here for just a second and just remind you that canals are not to be, don't swim in the canals. They're not meant to be played around or to be swimming in. So stay out, no nades. You see this sign, it's a warning. Stay out, no nades. No nades, Spanish means no swimming. The canals are deep, 12 feet deep. I know that there's, some of you have probably swam in water deeper than that. But the canal, what really makes it dangerous is the current, the way the water moves. The canal is shaped like what we call a trapezoid. It's narrow at the bottom, it's wide at the top. This often causes the water to move very fast through the narrow channel along the bottom, but more slowly along the top. This can affect what we call the current of the water, and it can create what we call an undertow, and it can pull a person under and they can drown, even if they're a good swimmer. So please stay away from the canals. And even then, if you're able to avoid the undertow in the canal, we have other dangerous things like these check gates. These check gates control the flow of the water, also called emergency control gates. We're going to learn later on in the story that these are very, very important to the operation of a canal. We'll show you why in a minute. But anyway, stay away from the canals. Okay, so brought up some pictures here. I need to change it because whenever I bring up the picture of Dr. Wozencraft with the date over his head, people think that that's how long he lived. What? He only lived from 1849 to 1859? No, that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is during that period of time, from 1849 to 1859, Dr. Wozencraft journeyed back to our nation's capital, back to Washington, D.C., and he pitched his idea. He told his idea for 10 years to our nation's representatives in the U.S. Congress. And essentially, he was trying to sell them on the idea that, hey, this is a good idea. The United States needs to invest in building a canal in Southern California. And so he said, give me some money, or he said, give me some land so I can build a canal. And they kept saying no. But man, persistence paid off. After 10 years, they finally said, okay, no problem. And the U.S. government actually gave Dr. Wozencraft 10 million acres of land in Southern California. And they said, here's your land that you asked for, now go build the canal. If you don't build the canal, you don't get to keep the land. Oh, okay. Well, he says, thank you for the land, but if I'm going to build the canal, I'm going to need some money, because he didn't have any money to build the canal. So from 1859 to 1862, he went back to Congress and he said, give me some money so I can build a canal. They didn't like that idea. And their final answer was no. Sorry, Charlie. No money for you to build your canal. Now, he tried and tried and tried. He tried to get just regular citizens to invest in his plan. Everybody thought he was kind of crazy. They said, you know what, a desert is a desert. You can't change it into something that it's not. You can't take a desert and turn it into farmland. And he said, I think we can. And but no one wanted to put up the money for it. So sadly, he died without ever seeing his canal built. He's what we call a tragic visionary. He had a good idea, but he was ahead of his time, and it never happened. Now, eventually that canal was built, and it did bring the water into Southern California, but it was somebody else that built it. Someone actually that was inspired by Dr. Wozencraft. So, sadly, had he had known, because the portion of land that the government gave him included this area where we live, the Coachella Valley. It was kind of all-encompassing here. Sadly, had he had known that in the Coachella Valley there was an abundance of water, but you couldn't see it. If you can read the screen, you see that it's labeled groundwater. In the Coachella Valley, we are blessed here with an abundance of water right under the ground. Looking at the surface, you wouldn't have a clue it was there. But if you dig just a little ways under the ground, you have access to this enormous resource. Now, he didn't know that. Had he known that, probably would have changed the way he approached this. But there were people living in the Coachella Valley at the time that knew there was groundwater here. Who were they? Yes, the Cahuilla Indians. We talked about them in third grade. Remember that? They got water from various means and sources in the Coachella Valley. One of the main sources was through hand-dug wells. They actually were one of the few tribes in North America that got water by digging wells, by digging into the ground. Now, the 49ers eventually learned about the wells that were in the Coachella Valley, but for the most part, they had no interest in settling this area or living here. It was just considered too hot, too barren, too dry. It was a very undesirable place. And that started to change around 1869, because in 1869, it ushered in what we call the Transcontinental Railroad. For the first time ever in the United States history, we had a railroad system. You could get on a train in Chicago, and you could actually take it all the way across the United States, all the way to the goldfields in Sacramento. By 1869, there wasn't much left of the goldfields anyway. But consider this, when the railroad opened up in 1869, you could travel across the United States in 5 days versus 6 months on foot or on horseback. So that was quite a leap. That was quite an advancement. And with the railroad, people got to see the country, and they started to speculate, consider about various places they could live. And one of the areas that people wondered about was the Coachella Valley. The railroad was able to transport people and goods across the nation, and it was all possible because of engines. In this case, they were called steam engines. So I thought it was kind of interesting to talk about how a steam engine operates. It's actually, in concept, it's pretty simple. I mean, to make one would be very complex, but let's take a look at a steam engine and how it works. And the reason I want to focus on this is because of the water component. Water plays a big part in this. Let's take a look. So if you were to cut a steam engine open and look at it from the side, you would see there's two main things that are needed to make that train go, right? You need fire and you're going to need water. The fire heats the water. When the water heats, it boils, it turns into steam. The smoke from the fire is released at the top of the train through the smokestack, and the steam from the water is released at the bottom of the train near the wheels, okay? And the way this pushes the train forward, it kind of works like this. So in this diagram here, you can see the hot steam is actually pushing this piston back and forth. And as the piston moves back and forth, it's connected to the wheels, and as the wheels turn, the train moves forward. Okay, it's ingenious. So the hotter the steam, the more steam you have, the more power you have, the faster you can go. Okay. Now, let's ask this question. What would happen if you tried to run a steam engine across a hot, dry, barren desert where there was no water for many, many miles? What would happen? Yeah, you've heard the term, you'd run out of steam. That's where it came from. Yeah, it came from the steam engines that ran out of water and they couldn't go anymore. It's kind of like a car running out of gas. So this is why it was so important that they not only build the railroads across the nation, but they had strategic locations where the trains could stop from time to time and refill with water. Stations like this. This is a refueling station for one of the trains. You can see that big barrel in the background, a big tower. This arm would come down and they would fill the nose of the train with water. Now, as people were considering the Coachella Valley, we're kind of going back in time a little bit here. We're now back in the year 1853. In 1853, when planners were trying to figure out where to put the railroad tracks, they were actually in the Coachella Valley in 1853. And one of the surveyors on this survey party was named William Blake. He was actually a geologist, scientist. And there was something in the Coachella Valley that caught his attention, and they actually drew a picture of it while they were on the journey. And you can see there's two guys on horses. One of the guy pointing there is William Blake. And what is he pointing at? He's pointing at a line on the mountains. I don't know if you can see that. Do you see that line on the mountains? That is a water line. And so Mr. Blake, being a geologist, he knew that they were traveling along a lake bed, that he knew at one point in time this whole area actually was filled with water. It was a huge lake. So that caught his attention, and he took note of it. And he concluded that a large portion of that water seeped underground and actually could be accessed by digging. And, you know, the fact that the Kauai were there accessing this water through hand-dug wells kind of confirmed his idea there. And so on his recommendation as to where they should put tracks, he said railroad tracks should definitely run through the Coachella Valley. And they did. In fact, one of the main water stops between Yuma, Arizona and Los Angeles was Indio. So to illustrate that, let's look at this map again. I put the year 1877 on there, and I put 3 cities. So the blue line there, that is the Colorado River that runs through Yuma, Arizona. And then the 3 cities to the farthest to the west, you see Los Angeles, and right in the middle is Indio, the blinking green, and then the last one is Yuma, Arizona. So by 1877, the railroad was transporting people from Los Angeles to Yuma, Arizona, and the halfway point was Indio. And this is where the trains would stop to refill with water. Here's a picture of the Indio train depot as it looked in the year 1901. And what was interesting here is that when the trains would stop to refill with water, it gave the people on the trains time to get off and walk around and check the place out. And as they would get off the trains and walk around and check the place out, they had a real estate office here, they had a post office, they had a restaurant, they had a hotel. And people, depending on what time of year they came through, kind of said, you know, this might be a good place to live. And land was cheap. I mean, you could buy an acre of land, remember that's the size of a football field, for $1.25 back then. Even back then, that was cheap. So people started staying in India. They started buying land, and they started farming. And how did they farm? Well, they dug wells. And here's a picture of a pioneer farming family. They bought a piece of land, and they drilled a well. And in this case, the water was so abundant that when they drilled down, the water actually, it came up out of the ground all by itself. We call this an artesian well. And so people started buying land and drilling these wells, and the water flowed like this, and they created farms. And so here we see the beginning of the water, of how water is starting to shape the desert in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so by 1906, they were farming about 4,000 acres of land here. Today we farm about 66,000 acres in the Coachella Valley. Much, much more down south. But anyway. So, I said that to say that the Coachella Valley very quickly was turning into a farming paradise. It actually was becoming everything that Dr. Wozencraft envisioned the desert could be. And they were doing it without a canal. They were doing it with just water from the ground. Okay. So, okay, a little historical stuff to put it into context. You know, when we think of pioneers, we tend to think of these rough and tough individuals. You know, we very rarely, though, consider that a lot of these rough and tumble individuals brought their children with them. This is a picture of a pioneering family, particularly the children of the pioneering family. They purchased a piece of land in the Coachella Valley to farm. And something I like to mention when we're at the schools, I like to say in these early days when the pioneers were starting to build the first towns and cities, there were no schools. Imagine that. What would it be like to move into a town and there was no school? You know, a lot of times I get cheers from the kids and they say, oh, that would be fantastic. But then I mentioned the reality of the situation. Consider this. Okay, there were no schools. So what did the children get to do all day? From sun up to sundown, they got to work on the farm with their parents to help try to earn a living for the family. And so you can imagine they were put to hard work, hard labor. It was not easy. And this, as strange as this may sound, when the first schools came into the Coachella Valley and the kids got up at 4 a.m. to go out and work in the fields, and the mom or the dad said, sorry, you can't go work today, you got to go to school. They said, oh, that's fantastic. Actually, it was a good thing for them. So anyway, here's a picture of one of the first schools in the Coachella Valley. This was Indio's schoolhouse. It was EST established, built in 1898. It was made of adobe brick. It was a one-room schoolhouse. The first teacher here taught grades 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, all in the same room, all at the same time. How did she do it? I don't know. Pretty amazing. The school had a bell on it. It was a gift from the railroad. The railroad, actually, I put a red circle there. You can see the bell on the train. They took the bell off the train and in 1897 gave it to the school as a gift. And it was there. It's still in the valley today. Here's a picture of the first school bell in the Coachella Valley. It's sitting as a memorial at Desert Sands Unified School District office. There it is. Go see it sometime. It's pretty cool. Let's see. What's my next picture? School bus, I think. You want to see a picture of the first school bus in the valley? Okay. There it is. Yeah, that was the first school bus in the valley. It was 2 mules and a cart. It was actually driven by 2 of the students up there, these 2 sisters. Every morning would hitch the mules to the cart, drive around town and pick everyone up for school. It didn't even get paid for it. Wow. Okay. One day in 1905, there was a big flood. Here's how it went down. Train pulled into the Indio train depot. It was a day like any other day. It was sunny out, fairly hot, nothing unusual. But the people that got off the train were trembling from fear. And the people milling around the Indio depot rushed up to them and they said, "Is everything okay?" They said, "No, everything's not okay." They said the train got hit with a big flood coming through the valley. We thought it was going to wash the train off the tracks, and we thought we were all going to die. And people looked around and they said, "How could this be? There's no rain anywhere. There's nothing that would indicate a disaster like this. What could be happening?" So to investigate, people got on a train going the other way towards Yuma. And lo and behold, there was a flood. Here's a picture of that flood from 1905. In fact, today we call it the Salton Sink Flood of 1905. And I don't know if you can see this, but look what it did. You can see the water there, and you can see what it did to the railroad tracks. Actually, eventually just washed them completely away. There's a gentleman standing there kind of checking out the scene. And I have some original video footage of this flood. It's very short. Don't blink or you'll miss it. It's about 8 seconds. But this is original footage of the flood from 1905. Let's check it out. There you go. So you can see, like all of these homes, all of these got buried. Today, completely underwater. So it was a devastating event. It lasted for almost 2 years, about 18 months. And so if you notice the path from Los Angeles, the line here traces the railroad tracks from Los Angeles to Yuma, Arizona. And you can see there's the Salton Sea. Salton Sea actually washed out, or the flood washed out a large portion of those tracks. So the Southern Pacific Railroad, to fix the problem, they just built some new tracks. They just built around it. And they figured, as everybody else did, that eventually it was going to go away. It was going to end. But it never ended. It just kept going and going and going. And here's a picture from 1906, about 1 year into the flood, of the railroad. This is the second set of railroad tracks being flooded again in 1906. They built a third set, and those were even being threatened of flooding. So it was a serious event. Sadly, the salt works was buried underwater. This is a picture of what it looked like in 1884. Here's a picture of it 1 year into the flood, 1906. You can see how high the water's risen. And by 1907, the salt works completely buried underwater. In fact, today, the salt works sits at the bottom of the Salton Sea. Now, this is not accurate. I just tried to give the impression so you understand that there's a salt company down there at the bottom of the Salton Sea. It's underwater. That's how serious the flood was. Pretty amazing. Now, what caused the flood? The flood eventually was blamed on this gentleman here, Mr. Charles Rockwood. Now, you heard me say that Dr. Wozencraft did not build his canal, but somebody else did. Well, that someone else was Mr. Rockwood. Mr. Rockwood, a few years later, came along, inspired by Dr. Wozencraft, said, "I'm going to build that canal." And he did. And from the year 1900 to the year 1904, that canal flowed from the Colorado River into the desert, to the barren wasteland portion of the desert there, and turned it into farmland, productive farmland. It was very profitable, some of the most profitable land in the United States at that time. He changed the name of the area to from the Salton Sink to the Imperial Valley. And things were going great for a few short years. But then in 1905, his canal dried up. And the farmers could not get water. And their crops were beginning to die. And the farmers got angry and they said, "You promised us water. You need to give us water or we're going to sue you. We demand to get our money." So what caused the canal to dry up? It was the river, the Colorado River. You remember me saying that the Colorado River back then was not like it is today? Here's a picture of what the water would have looked like back then. Okay, there is what the Colorado River normally looks like. Rio Colorado, the Red River. This is how the Spanish saw it, and this is how they named it, the Red River. And it has that muddy red color to it because of it's loaded with mud and silt and dirt. And it's been said of the Colorado River, it's too thick to drink, too thin to plow. It's kind of hard to deal with, but that's what they used. And what happened was the mud in the water clogged up the canal and choked it off, and they couldn't get any more water. So Dr. Wozencraft, in a desperate attempt to get more water, built another canal, emergency channel, and things were going great for a while, but then it ran out of control. He did not build what we call a check gate. Remember the check gate on the canal? And check gates are very important because if the water gets out of control, you have to have a way to turn it off. And he did not put one on there because he didn't have time. So he did not put a check gate. The canal flooded, he couldn't turn it off, and it ran out of control. What happened was he wanted just a little bit of water from the Colorado River, and he got the whole river. The whole river turned in 1905 and started flowing as it had in times past, actually. This is what caused the big lake to form years before. And it ran out of control for nearly 2 years and just destroyed a lot of property. To help us see this a little better, in this picture here, we see the three cities connected by the railroad, Los Angeles, Indio, and Yuma. And then running through Yuma, you see the blue line, that's the Colorado River, running down to the Gulf of California, down to Mexico. And here's the flood. The flood actually turned and flowed north, and you can see the damage it did to the railroad tracks there. Well, it was eventually stopped. And when it was stopped, that's about how big the lake was. Had it not been stopped, it would have continued to flood until it looked like this. And so that's what they were worried about, was that it would just continue to flood. So how were they able to stop it? To answer that, well, first let's take a look at this picture here. So you can see there's the water line. You can see how high it is. That's a line that represents about 300 feet as far as depth of water. And that's what it would have filled up to had they not stopped it. The people that stopped the flood actually worked for the Southern Pacific Railroad. The Southern Pacific Railroad, really, the way they made money was they put stuff on their trains and they hauled the stuff from city to city, and then they sold the stuff. And so people paid the railroad to put stuff on the trains. And so if the rails are washed out, they can't move. They're not making any money. And so the railroad said, well, we got to fix it. And they did. So they built a bridge. You can see the bridge there. It's called a trestle, a railroad trestle across the flood. And day and night for 52 days, they ran these cars, these train cars across the bridge, across the trestle. And on the back of the train cars, they had these huge rocks called boulders. And you can see one, there's one of those big boulders there. And these guys with crowbars, these metal bars, they would get under them and they would heave the rocks into the flood. And they did that day and night for 52 days. They dumped rocks and sand and gravel into the flood and eventually stopped the flood. They created what we call a dam It stopped the water, the river changed course, and went back into its normal channel, flowed back into Mexico. The end result was the formation of the Salton Sea, which is still here today, amazingly. If you haven't seen the Salton Sea, there's a picture of it as it looks from an airplane. It's about 12 miles wide, 35 miles long. Salton Sea is the largest lake in California. It's very salty. The Salton Sea is not what I call a normal lake or normal. It's not normal. A normal lake, salt flows in and salt flows out. Now, in the soil, in the dirt, there's soil or there's salt. When water flows across the dirt, across the soil, it dissolves the salt. The water, even fresh water, has a little bit of salt in it. If you don't get rid of that salt, then it builds up over time, and that lake can get very, very salty. So this would be a picture of a normal lake. So you have salt in the water coming into the lake, but then you have water leaving the lake. And the water leaving the lake goes to the ocean, so the salt's deposited in the ocean, and the water in the lake stays fresh. Okay? That's not how it works with the Salton Sea. With the Salton Sea is in a bowl. It sits low. It's in a depression. And water can only flow in. It cannot flow out. So what happens is over time, the salty water comes in and it gets saltier and saltier and saltier. And the only way water can leave is through evaporation. And so today, the Salton Sea is very salty. It's saltier than the ocean. And if you want to see how much salt goes into the Salton Sea every year, there you go. About 4 million tons a year goes into the Salton Sea. It's pretty incredible. Okay, let's go back to the flood. The people in the Imperial and the Coachella Valleys, they lost a lot of property. There was a lot of damage. People lost their homes, they lost their farms, and they were worried it was going to happen again. And so they started talking to the government, the federal government. And they started saying things like, the government should protect us from future floods. Government needs to do something about this. And the federal government, it took some years, took a lot of years, but they finally responded and said, okay, we're going to do something about it. We're going to protect you guys in the Imperial and the Coachella Valleys from flooding. And what they did was they built a dam on the river today called Hoover Dam. And there's a picture of it. Big, huge concrete dam that goes across the Colorado River. And now, if there's a flood on the river, there's Lake Mead behind the dam. The flood waters hit the back of the dam and don't go anywhere. They just are stored. They stay in the lake. And then the water can be released at a nice, even rate so that it doesn't threaten anybody with flooding. Just to show you the size of Lake Mead, this is kind of fun. So there's Hoover Dam. Look at the water piling up behind Hoover Dam. It's starting to turn into a big lake. If you really want to see how huge it is, you have to go into outer space to see it. Here's a satellite picture from outer space of Lake Mead behind Hoover Dam. There it is. I outlined it in blue so you can see it a little better, but that's Lake Mead. Now, can anybody find Hoover Dam in that picture? Let me point it out. There it is. That, man, look at that. That little dam is holding back all that water. That is crazy. So there it is, the mighty Hoover Dam controlling the Colorado River. And it's used to stop flooding. It's used to irrigate farmland. And the water is also used to generate clean hydroelectricity. That's like hydropower is from generator or water that's turned by generators turned by water. The generators in Hoover Dam actually generate enough electricity to supply 2 cities the size of San Francisco. That's like 3 million people a day. Pretty amazing. And here's where it gets a little interesting. You see on this picture, these pictures here on the right, there's the Colorado River as it looks today. You see, it's not that muddy red color anymore. It's that nice blue, kind of normal color. What happened to the mud? Any ideas? Yeah, the mud actually gets trapped behind the dam. And what that means is every year that mud is getting a little deeper and a little deeper and a little deeper behind Hoover Dam. Yeah. I was told that they estimate in about 500 years that Hoover Dam will actually it'll be filled with mud, and it'll turn into a waterfall, probably about 500 years. So interesting thought. But you can see in the picture on the left, water's being released from the lake behind Hoover Dam, Lake Mead. It's going through pipes in the canyon walls and being re-released back into the river, and it travels along the way, and then it's picked up by canals. Yes, we do have many canals today, thanks to Dr. Wozencraft. And in the Coachella Valley, we use water from the Colorado River. We feed it into canals, and the canals bring this Colorado River water to our farms. Now, in the Coachella Valley, we do not drink this water. We use it only for farming and a few other things, but mainly farming. And so this makes farmers very happy because they have this nice water source. And essentially, I said this whole story has led up to this point. And if you look at what this area looked like in 1849 versus how it looks today, there it is. You can see that this area was in fact shaped by water. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.